The scene I have loaded in is called landscape underscore A underscore 0001, and this can be found within the group A landscape only folder. And this is going to be our A group, which is basically for the preservation of the landscape itself, so that we always have something to go back to if we want to grab any of the functions and bring them into the other groups we're going to be creating. Now we're going to be setting up around 6 different letter groups in order to break down the scene and work on specific areas of it. So right now we just have the A group, and you can load in this scene, and I just have it rendered out, just a really basic render, lower quality. And what we're going to be doing is creating an ecosystem for this entire terrain. And we're not going to be paying attention to any specific area unless we get into more close-up zones. But what I want to create is the most flexible environment as possible. In other words, being able to move around this terrain wherever we want and set up our shot, and not worrying about having to redesign our ecosystem or our distribution layers. So before we begin breaking down the scene, let's first take a look at the overall terrain. There's quite a large area to work with, and I just want to show you a few things about the terrain that are pretty important. And if we go over to the right, what I'm going to do is switch this over to sort by types, and then we can expand our terrain and select our terrain, and we have it named landscape. The group that it's also showing up in may show up as procedural terrains rather than just terrains. If we right mouse click with the terrain selected, we can go to Edit Object to open up the terrain editor. Now what I've done is turn down the pixel resolution of our terrain down to 32 by 32 pixels. This is going to increase the refresh rate whenever we open up the terrain editor to modify the procedural. Now normally the default value is set. If you right mouse click on create a standard terrain or a height field terrain, we can see the option is height field terrain in editor. This will open the new terrain option, which gives us the ability to put in a pixel size. Mine is 256 by 256, which means any terrain you create in the scene, whether it's procedural or standard, is going to have 256 by 256 pixels for the pixel amount of the preview. Now that pixel amount is primarily for painting on your terrain and adding to the procedural. We are using a purely procedural terrain. We're not going to be using any of the road functions or any sort of image editing with it. We want to keep it as much of a pure fractal and procedural as possible. And because of this, what we can do is just reduce by hitting the divide by 2 button to basically divide it in half, and you can keep doing that until you get to a lower amount. If you go too low, sometimes you can run into the possibility of refresh error. 32 by 32 seems to be good for this terrain. Now if we go to the procedural tab, you can see our mapping mode is set to world. And we also have the scale of our altitude production set to 1. Now with the world mapping mode, we can go ahead and just click OK to close out the terrain editor right now. If at any time we find ourselves needing more area for our terrain, or we need to increase its size, using the world mapping mode will allow us to scale the terrain, make it larger, without moving any of the elements or changing the size of any of the elements within the terrain. So all of our mountains and low areas, high areas will stay exactly the same. So if we decide we want to move over to the edge of the scene, and now we find ourselves with a lack of terrain, and where the landscape just cuts off, we can either move the terrain over to fill in the space. We could use the Move Gizmo. If we go to Display and Gizmos, I have Show Gizmos, Show Gizmo Helpers, and allow moving outside gizmos on. I'm using the Move Gizmo, which is the upper right of the right column in R3, where we have Move, Rotation, and Scale. And then on the left we have the parent, local, global, and view coordinates. I'm going to use the global coordinate. But if we want, all we have to do is just move this over, and we can fill in any of the space where it's lacking a terrain. I'm just going to go ahead and undo this and move it back to where I had it. You can also scale it up if you want to make it larger, and you don't have to worry about losing any of your detail. You will, of course, have to wait for the terrain to refresh. But other than that, a world mapping mode is extremely flexible and really useful when setting up your scene. Once you have the initial setup created, you can move from that world mapping mode if needed, and you can also convert it to another mode. If we go ahead and open up, right mouse click with the terrain selected, go to Edit Object, and in the terrain editor in our procedural tab, we can switch the mapping mode to a parametric mode, which will take our procedural and lock it to the size of our terrain. So then as we scale, it will scale the entire terrain and not just expand it. And once you switch to another mode, View will ask you if you want to apply nodes to preserve the current geometry. And what that will do is prevent the loss of scale. And you can click Yes to add those nodes. Right now we're going to keep everything the way it's at with the world mapping mode. And I'm going to right mouse click in that procedural to edit the function, and we can take a look at the landscape I've created. It's really basic. There's two primary nodes that create the geometry for our terrain, and then I have another fractal node that is breaking it up and distributing between the two with a blender. Now this offset is really just here for organization. So if I wanted to modify just the mixing fractal, I could select that origin a lot easier, and that becomes more important when you're working with really complex nodes. So basically, let's take a look. We have what I've called terrain noise is basically just a simple fractal which you can create over here on the left by selecting the fractal, and then I've chosen the terrain Perlin noise to generate our shape. And if you click edit, you can get some more options to modify this noise. And if we go over to the second fractal that's being mixed with, I just have a Perlin noise value. So Perlin noise, the value option. And there's only two settings for this, animated and ridged, and we are going to make sure we have that ridge turned off because it will create some very fine seams, and that's something that is typically only used for materials. Although you can get away with using it with a terrain, you're going to end up with some render problems normally. So I have a combiner node. If we go over to the left, you can see where we can add a combiner. I have it set to the blender, which gives us a ratio option and the ability to connect with a number output to another node. The combination mode is multiply, so we're taking these two nodes and combining them together, taking the number output from the second fractal and multiplying the number output of the first. And that's why we have the divots within our terrain and some of the higher peaks and some nice variation. Now what I have called amp mix is a gradient amplitude Perlin noise. So Perlin noise, gradient amplitude, and if you go to edit, I have this set to around 0.58. So overall, it's a very basic setup. Now, the reason we don't see any previews, we'll go to our preview options, change this to just the 2D plane. The reason we're not really seeing anything is because of our scale. Our wavelength is set to 10 for our primary two nodes, and for our mixer node, we've got it set to 10, and then on the Z, 20. Because of these large values, in order to keep the scale at the procedural set to 1, we really can't see the preview within the function editor itself. What we can do is open the function output observer, and this is going to show us our terrain. So while we're working on any sort of terrain and modifying these nodes, we want to make sure we have the output observer open. And in this case, I have the Autofit on, which is going to make sure that we can see the entire terrain, because we can often run into instances where we have an oversampling. And if we take a look, I have the gain set fairly high on our mixer, and the gain set to 1.5 for the terrain Perlin noise. And what this will do is create very harsh contrast between the number output, far more than a value of 1 and -1, which is the normal number range. So the autofit option will allow you to view the terrain, but we're not really seeing a whole lot of depth. So what we can do is turn on the only when saturating value, and this will refresh the terrain. But as you can see, it looks the same, because technically this is what it's supposed to look like with this on, and before we kind of had a little bit of a refresh error. So if I turn this off now, we should see a much better looking terrain showing up. So if you ever run into that problem when you're editing a terrain fractal, you can check on only when saturating and then turn it off right away, and then you can start to see something that looks a little bit better, something a little easier to work with. Now in this case, it's raised up quite a lot, and a lot more than what we actually have in the scene. What you can also do is, if you turn back on the only when saturating, you can go ahead and zoom in to see the terrain a little bit better, and something a little bit closer to what's in the current scene. Turn that off, you can see a little bit better. If you want to move to a specific spot, you can change the origin, which will allow you to move around the preview. Now if you're working on a specific area within the scene, what you can do is select your camera, and now that I'm clicking outside of the function editor, it's just going to refresh our terrain. But if we go ahead and select our main camera, go to the numerics tab, which is at the center up at the top next to the aspect tab. And because I had a panel open, what it did was open the advanced camera options. I'm just going to go ahead and close that out. But if we go to the ruler tab and we take a look at the position, we can use the values that we have set for the X, Y, and Z to get an idea of where we want the origin to show up for our output observer. And now the values you would have to set for that are going to be tied to what we have set in our units and coordinates tab. So if you go to File and Options, Units and Coordinates, our internal unit is set to 0.1, which means if we wanted the origin to equal what we have within our position, we would need to add a 0 to the end of these values. So basically, our Z, we have 328.91 meters. We would type in an origin value for the Z, 3,280 approximately, or we could just bump the decimal point over and do 3,289. Now, in this case with the z-axis, you wouldn't want to change that origin of the z because terrains are basically null on the z-axis. The amount of scaling for a material is not valid on the z-axis. You can actually remove the information, setting wavelengths to 0, and it won't modify the terrain, or it will minimally. Because basically what we have is a flat plane with a bunch of polygons, and then that is elevated. Of course, those polygons are continually divided in order to create an infinite amount of geometry. But just in that case, the z would not be valid for the origin. So you would want to set the x and the y. Now, because we have that procedural scale set to 1, it's going to be very easy for us to use these procedurals and the fractals we have generating the terrain also for the materials. And in this case, I'm not using any of the fractals to generate the material. And we're going to take a look at the material setup right now. And what I have is a layered material. I'm not using any sort of mixed materials. Personally, I try to avoid using a mixed material because all the options available and the output of a mixed material can all be generated with a combination of simple materials. And sometimes when you're using mixed materials, you can have your scale changing too frequently, and once you start adding ecosystem layers to a mixed material, you can sometimes run into some problems, especially with scale issues. And at the moment, if you add more than 2 ecosystem layers to a mixed material, your terrain will turn transparent, which makes it a little difficult to work with in the scene. So what I have is a bunch of different layers that I'm using to create our material. And I'm controlling these primarily with the Environment tab, setting our altitude range and slope range. Altitude and slope are two of the most important elements for distribution of materials, ecosystems, terrains themselves, although in most cases with a terrain, the altitude and slope don't count because that z-axis is null. And I'm just going to show that last render I made and had started out with. And we're just going to take a look at some of these different layers. Now, the bottom layer that we have, that does not have the Environment tab, because this is the base layer. This is the lighter rock that we're seeing distributed on the steeper slopes. The next layer I have, we can go to the Environment tab now that we're using an additional layer on top of another one. And basically what this is a darker version of the rock. And what I've done is turn down our alpha boost, which is creating more of a transparent layer. If we go into edit the function, I just have a fast Perlin fractal with a turbulence node tied to that. And then I'm using a smooth threshold, which is going to make a more sharper cutout and blend between the two materials. And then I just have an absolute wave filter on in order to increase the amount of detail. So then we can see the darker areas showing up throughout parts of the terrain. And that's just a really basic distribution. And the next layer up is the grass main cover, and this is primarily the major green grass that we see. This is set to only show up on flatter areas with just a little bit of fuzziness and a blend between steep and flat areas. The grass bleed that I have is set up a little bit differently, and what I have is a more yellow, kind of darker color green, and what this is doing is going around the edges of our grass main cover to make it a little yellower just where the transition points are. And the alpha boost is also turned down on this one in order to create a more transparent layer. If we edit the function, you can see I also have the same sort of a setup for our alpha and basically our transparency, although this one does not have a turbulence node. The next layer up is another variation of the grass where it's a brighter yellow, and I have this set to a preferred orientation. In other words, it's going to show up in a specific direction on the terrain behind high altitude elements, so showing up behind where I wanted the shadowed areas, where the grass would get less light and would be a little bit of a different color. So I have these kind of set up. You really can't see it all that well. We can always go back and tweak this. This is of course just the base material. And I just want to do a quick overview so you can see how it's set up. And if you want to examine the scene yourself and take a look, play around with it, please do. And I do have just one little error showing up. Even though I have it set to by object, it is showing an absolute altitude range. Normally it's a value from -1 to 1, and right now it's showing -100K to 100K. And that's because the sand underwater layer that I have is set to absolute. And that went and changed all of the other sliders. So what you can do is switch them all to absolute, but these layers are primarily set up at full altitude except the grass bleed, which ends at 50 meters and then starts to fade out, which I have a large amount for. The sand underwater is just what we're starting to see around the rim of the infinite water plane I have. And that's just to show up underneath the water so that it's not the exact same material as what's on the terrain. These are of course temporary, they can be modified, is just the starting point. The main reason I wanted to have this water plane in here from the beginning is because it is going to affect our ecosystem population by using decay near foreign objects. So we want to make sure we have that in the scene from the start in order to have that object manipulating the distribution of our ecosystem. If we take a look at the landscape and go to our numerics tab, select the middle option, take a look at size, we can see it's around 4.3 kilometers. And that is for our width on the X and the Y. And its total height is 193 meters. And that's going from below our water level. And if we take a look at the front view, I'm just double clicking on the main camera view and the top of our selected view in order to open up the viewport mode, which I just have condensed right now into 2. So we can see our terrain going below our water plane, which is the only infinite plane in the scene right now. I do not have a ground plane because I don't need it. And if we take a look at the height of the water, go to our position, we can just see it's 1.5 meters or so above the 0 point. So if we go back into our landscape and take a look at the material for that sand underwater, I have it set to 2 meters, which is why I'm using the absolute mode. I can reference the position on the z-axis of our water and where it's at, and just make this material fall off slightly above it or below it. In this case, I'm going around 0.5 meters above it, and I may need to change that a little bit later. For now, it should be okay. I am going to do one thing and just set it to -5 for the alpha boost. And the reason for that is because in the render I saw before, that sand was a little too bright. So I just want to sort of blend it in a little bit better. We could also modify the color, diffuse settings, but for the most part, the material is set up as a pretty good base layer and something to start out with. And this way we're working with a terrain that is already somewhat developed, and we're not starting it completely from scratch. So if you want to be able to go back into any terrains you've created or load in some of the preset terrains that already have materials, you'll know how to work with a terrain that already has a material. Plus, we can use some of these material options in order to help us with the population. Also, with the fractals that are generating this. So before we move on to planning out our ecosystem population and setting up our terrain zones and our different groups, the first thing I want to do is edit our object for our terrain with the terrain selected. And what I'm going to do is select Save. Now, what I've done is created a folder called Project Content. And I've created multiple folders within that directory in order to break down all of the elements we're going to be using for the scene. Now, we might not end up using all of these folders, but they're there as a starting point and to help us organize everything and keep it separate from some of the default view materials and objects, because we are going to be manipulating them and changing the scenes quite frequently. And I do highly suggest that you keep all of your custom scenes and projects you're working on out of the default view directory, just because with updates and ever having to reinstall Vue, then you don't have to worry about losing any of your content. Plus, it makes it a little bit easier to just load in those libraries and keep Vue a little more organized when you're working and switching between different projects. So I've already created a folder called Terrains. And what I want to do is save this landscape. And I'm going to give it the same name as the scene file. Landscape A1. And you could add a description if you want. I'm going to keep the current preview. And now incorporate texture maps and compress file. If you have any texture maps or anything creating the altitude of your terrain or any texture maps tied into the material, those will all be saved with your terrain and the material. In this case, I'm using 100% procedural material and terrain, no images, so it's going to be a small file size. If you're working with images and you're in the early stages or not at the final scene where you need to be transferring it, then I would suggest turning off incorporate texture maps, because you're just going to keep your file size really, really large by including textures with it every single time you save. The only time you'd really want to use this setting if you have a bunch of images in the scene or textures is when you have the final scene completed, or you're getting ready to do any sort of network rendering, transfer between systems, and that way everything is incorporated within either objects or scene files or materials, anything you're saving out. Since I don't really have to worry about any material conflicts, I'm just going to go ahead and save it with those options on. And it's just going to create a little bit of a preview. I'll just click OK. So now we have a terrain saved out, just as sort of a backup in case we ever need to load it back in. And what we're going to start doing is kind of evaluating what we have in our current scene from our terrain, and basically what we can use to distribute our ecosystem throughout the scene. And I do want to just make one more note, and if we go ahead and open up the material, even though some of these materials, although somewhat modified, are the ones that come with Vue, I've made sure I've renamed them. And it's really important that you create a unique name for every layer and every material you're working on. Sometimes even between identical objects or maybe two landscapes that have the same material you want on them, it's still a good idea to have separate material names so you don't run into any overwrites or any problems with the scene, because sometimes you can run into some issues when you have duplicate material names. And we're going to be keeping these right now, although we'll be modifying them, creating some different variations. And now we're going to prepare for breaking down the scene and just working with what we have, taking a look at the elevation, the different slope ranges, and what we can pull out of the terrain itself to distribute our ecosystem before we go in and create any custom fractals. And it's just going to be a lot easier to work with our ecosystem, and it's going to look a lot more realistic if we're using the elevation and slope to distribute our ecosystem. So now what I'm going to do is save our scene, saving as, and we're going to create a new folder in the scenes directory called Group B Distribution. And I'm also just going to add from terrain. And now I'm going to change the name to Landscape B from the A group, and just modify our description. Once again, I don't really have any texture maps in the scene, so I'm not worried about incorporating that. Once we start working with ecosystems, every single texture map for every leaf of every single plant species will be saved when using incorporate texture maps. So we'll probably start turning that off once we reach that stage. For right now, Landscape B, save, and now we have a starting point. We can fall back to our other scene if needed, if something goes wrong, but mainly what we want to do is have different groups set up where we can save out materials from simpler scenes without extra copies of the terrain that we're going to have, and modified versions, different material changes, and this way we can save all of those out separately and load them in to our final scene and our final groups of scenes, depending if we're going to be having close-ups and then more perspective type views.